All right, settle in. Find a comfortable spot. Maybe pull up a blanket. Let the weight of the day just dissolve. We're going to drift back in time, not to a place you'll find on any map, but to one that feels familiar. A kingdom built on whispers, with a court so polished you could see your own reflection in it and all of your flaws. This is the story of the kingdom of Veridia and a young king who was about to learn that power is a very, very sleepy and treacherous thing. Our story begins, as these things often do, with a funeral. The old king of Veridia had finally, after a long and frankly quite boring reign, decided to call it a day. His son, Alaric, was now King Alaric just Alaric for now. He was 19 years old, with hair the color of straw and a disposition to match. He had spent his life in the shadow of his father, a stern and unyielding man who believed that preparing his son for kingship meant teaching him how to properly hold a fork and not much else. Alaric was, to put it kindly, a blank slate. A very handsome, very well-dressed blank slate, but a blank slate nonetheless. The court of Veridia was a place of dazzling surfaces. The palace was known as the Sunstone Citadel, a confection of white marble and gold leaf that gleamed so brightly it was said you could see it from the moon. Not that anyone in Veridia had been to the moon, of course. They were far too busy with more important matters like gossiping. The courtiers were peacocks, preening and posturing in silks and velvets, their smiles as bright and hard as the diamonds they wore. They were all masters of the subtle art of the backhanded compliment and the strategically placed rumor. It was a beautiful, glittering viper's nest, and into this nest stepped King Alaric, blinking in the sudden glare of attention. He was utterly, hopelessly out of his depth. He'd inherited a kingdom, a treasury, an army, and a council of advisors who all seemed to be speaking a language he didn't understand. Words like tariffs and diplomatic envoys and fiscal responsibility floated around him like bothersome gnats. He would nod sagely, trying to look kingly, while mentally cataloging the birds he could see outside the council chamber window. He was a boy who had been given a crown when what he really wanted was a nap. Now, a vacuum of power is a terrible thing to waste, and in the court of Veridia, there were many who were more than happy to fill it, but none were as prepared, as patient, and as aesthetically pleasing as the Duchess Seraphina. Seraphina was not young, but she was timeless. She had the kind of beauty that made you forget what you were saying mid-sentence. Her hair was the color of polished obsidian, and her eyes held a galaxy of secrets. She moved with a liquid grace, her gowns whispering over the marble floors. She was a work of art, and she knew it. She had been a fixture at court for years, a distant cousin to the royal line, always present, always observing. While others scrambled for position and favor, Seraphina simply watched. She understood the court's intricate dance better than anyone. She knew who was in debt, who was having an affair, and who had a weakness for candied figs. She was a master of information, and she knew that information used correctly was more powerful than any army. She saw in Alaric not a king, but a key. A beautifully crafted, very naive key that could unlock everything she had ever wanted. Her approach was a masterpiece of subtlety. She didn't throw herself at the young king as some of the more ambitious ladies of the court did. Instead, she offered him something he desperately needed, a friend. She would find him in the royal library, looking lost among the towering shelves, and she would talk to him not about statecraft, but about poetry. She would listen, really listen, to his rambling thoughts on falconry. She made him feel seen, understood. She created a little quiet island for him in the middle of the chaotic sea of his new life. She was patient. She would bring him a cup of spiced wine when he looked weary after a long council meeting. She would challenge him to a game of chess, letting him win just often enough to feel clever. She never asked for anything. She simply gave her time, her attention, her gentle, calming presence. Alaric, who had never known such kindness,
such effortless intimacy, was completely and utterly captivated. He began to seek her out, to rely on her. Her quiet corner of the palace became his sanctuary. The court, of course, noticed. There were whispers, a raised eyebrow here, and a shared smirk there. But Seraphina was untouchable. She was the Duchess, a woman of impeccable breeding and flawless reputation. And she was so very discreet. Their friendship, as everyone called it, seemed so wholesome. The lonely young king and the kind worldly duchess. It was a lovely story and a very effective cover. The seduction, when it happened, was not a grand dramatic affair. It was as quiet and deliberate as everything else she did. A lingering touch of her hand on his arm, a shared glance across a crowded ballroom that felt like a secret, a late-night conversation in the library that ended with a closeness that was both terrifying and exhilarating for the young king. She didn't conquer him. She simply opened a door, and he walked through it without a moment's hesitation. He was lost, or from her perspective, he was found. And as Alaric fell deeper under her spell, the kingdom began to feel the subtle shift. An old incompetent minister was dismissed, replaced by a foppish young man who happened to be a cousin of Seraphina's. A lucrative trade agreement was suddenly altered, benefiting a merchant guild that had paid a hefty sum to the Duchess. Alaric would sign the documents she put in front of him, his mind on the scent of her perfume, his thoughts on the promise of the evening to come. He was the king of Veridia, ruler of all the land, but he was, in every way that mattered, her subject. The court of mirrors had found its new master, and she ruled not from the throne, but from the shadows beside it. The first act of our sleepy little drama was over, and the real trouble, of course, was just beginning.
So, our young King Alaric was occupied while he was busy discovering the finer points of poetry and the intoxicating allure of the Duchess Seraphina. The kingdom of Veridia kept on turning, or rather, it began to turn in a slightly different direction, a direction that was, coincidentally, always favorable to the Duchess and her growing circle of friends. It was all very subtle, of course, a quiet word here, a misplaced document there. Politics, at its heart, is the art of making significant changes seem like mundane administrative tasks, and Seraphina was a true artist. She never attended council meetings. That would have been far too obvious. Instead, she would debrief Alaric afterwards in the comfort of his private chambers. She would sit beside him, refilling his wine glass, and ask him about his day. And as he, bless his simple heart, would recount the tedious debates, she would gently reframe them. "That Baron Blackwood," she might say with a thoughtful frown, "he seems so stressed. Do you think he's truly up to the task of managing the royal mint? I heard his nephew is a wonderfully clever boy with numbers." And just like that, a seed was planted. A week later, Baron Blackwood would be enjoying a sudden, unexpected retirement in the countryside, and Seraphina's new ally would be counting the kingdom's gold. Alaric, for his part, was blissfully unaware. He was in love, or at least he was in the grip of a powerful infatuation that felt like love, which is often the same thing, especially when you're 19. Seraphina had become the center of his universe. His first thought upon waking was of her, and his last thought at night was the lingering scent of her jasmine perfume on his pillows. He felt, for the first time in his life, truly alive. He mistook his complete dependence on her for a profound connection. It's an easy mistake to make. He was a king with no power, but he felt like the most powerful man in the world because he had her. The court began to change. The old guard, the stern, competent advisors who had served Alaric's father, found themselves slowly but surely pushed to the margins. They were offered prestigious but powerless positions in distant embassies. They were encouraged to take long, restorative holidays. One of them, a rather grumpy but effective general, was suddenly discovered to have a passion for landscape painting and was given a generous pension to pursue his newfound hobby. It was all done with the utmost courtesy. Seraphina was a great believer in courtesy. It was so much more efficient than cruelty. In their place, a new set of faces appeared,
younger, more fashionable people who laughed a little too loudly at the king's weak jokes and who all seemed to owe the Duchess a favor. The court, once a stuffy and formal place, became a whirlwind of parties and masked balls. The treasury, once carefully managed, was now being used to fund ever more extravagant entertainments. A flock of exotic, jewel-toned birds was imported from the far south at immense cost, simply because Seraphina had admired a drawing of them in a book. Alaric thought it was a wonderful idea. It made her happy, and her happiness was the only policy that truly mattered to him. But not everyone was swept up in the glamour. Lord Valerius, the former Master of Whispers and Alaric's father's most trusted advisor, had been one of the first to be gently nudged into retirement. He was an old man with eyes that had seen too much and a mind that was still razor sharp. He had not retired to the country to paint landscapes. He had retired to his city estate, just a stone's throw from the palace, and he was doing what he did best, listening. His network of informants, built over a lifetime of service, was still intact, and the whispers they brought him were troubling. Valerius saw the pattern that others missed. He saw the dismissed officials, the altered trade routes, the sudden influx of wealth into the coffers of Seraphina's family. He saw a king who was becoming a ghost in his own court, a smiling figurehead who seemed to have abdicated all responsibility. He knew, with a certainty that chilled his old bones, that the kingdom was in danger. But what could he do? To speak out against the Duchess would be to speak out against the king's companion. It would be seen as an act of treason, or worse, of jealousy. He needed proof. Something concrete, something that even a love-struck boy king could not ignore. So Valerius began his own quiet investigation. He met with disgruntled merchants in smoky taverns. He paid servants to report on the conversations they overheard in the palace corridors. It was a dangerous game. The Seraphina's influence was everywhere. Her own network of spies was formidable, and she had a way of making her enemies simply disappear. Not in a vulgar, bloody way. They would just be gone. A sudden business opportunity in a far-off land, an unexpected inheritance that required their immediate and permanent attention. It was all very neat and tidy. Meanwhile, Seraphina was beginning to enjoy the fruits of her labor. She was, for all intents and purposes, the ruler of Veridia. She held audiences in her lavish chambers, dispensing favors and passing judgments. Foreign dignitaries quickly learned that if you wanted a treaty signed, you didn't petition the king, you sent a very expensive gift to the Duchess. She was building her own shadow government, one that was far more efficient and far more decisive than Alaric's bumbling council. She was good at it too. It turned out that running a kingdom was not so different from running a noble household. It just involved larger sums of money and more important people. Alaric's isolation was now almost complete. His old friends from his youth found their invitations to the palace were frequently lost. His days were structured by Seraphina. A morning ride with her, a midday meal with her, an afternoon of music chosen by her, and the long, intoxicating evenings spent, of course, with her. He was living in a beautiful gilded cage, and he didn't even know it. He thought he was free. He was a king, after all. He just didn't notice that the bars of his cage were made of jasmine-scented silk and soft whispered words. But whispers have a way of spreading. The common people, far from the glittering court, began to notice the changes. The taxes were higher to pay for the endless parties. The price of bread was rising, while the palace kitchens imported iced strawberries from the northern mountains. They started calling Seraphina the Shadow Queen. It wasn't said loudly, of course, but it was said in the markets, in the workshops, in the fields, a quiet, resentful murmur that was slowly growing louder. Valerius heard it. He knew that resentment was like a dry forest. All it needed was a single spark to set it ablaze. He had to find his proof, and he had to find it soon. He decided to focus on the royal seal. The king's seal was the ultimate symbol of his authority. Every royal decree decree, every law, every official appointment had to be stamped with it. Alaric, he knew, was careless. He would leave it lying on his desk or entrust it to a valet who, Valerius discovered, had a sister who was in desperate need of money for a dowry. It was a long shot, a very risky long shot, but it was the only one he had. The shadows were deepening over Veridia, and somewhere in the darkness, a faint spark was about to be struck.
Life for King Alaric settled into a strange, dreamlike rhythm. His world had shrunk to the size of the Sunstone Citadel, and at the center of that world was Seraphina. He existed in a state of perpetual, pleasant fog. His days were a soft focus montage of luxury and leisure. He would wake late in a bed piled high with silk pillows to find a breakfast of his favorite things already laid out. The choices had been made for him, of course, but they were always choices he would have made anyway, or so he believed. It's remarkable how easily one's tastes can be guided. He was the ruler of a vast and powerful kingdom, but he couldn't have told you the current price of grain. He was the commander of a great army, but he probably couldn't have found the armory. These were details, and details were for other people to worry about. His primary duty, as he saw it, was to be kingly, to wear the fine clothes, to smile at the right moments, to be a radiant and untroubled symbol of the nation. Seraphina had convinced him that a king's greatest strength was his serenity. A troubled monarch, she would murmur, unsettled the people. It was his job to remain above the fray. It was a very appealing philosophy for a young man who found the fray to be deeply boring. He was living in a gilded cage, a prison of unimaginable comfort. The finest foods, the softest fabrics, the most beautiful music, all at his command. He had everything a man could want, except for a single, genuine thought of his own. His opinions were reflections of Seraphina's. His desires were planted by her. She was the most gifted conversationalist, able to steer him toward a conclusion he believed he had reached himself. It was a form of artistry. "I've been thinking," he might say at a council meeting, "that we should lower the tariffs on imported silks." He would be quite proud of this sudden economic insight, never realizing that Seraphina had spent the previous evening talking about how lovely a new gown of that very silk would look on her. The public saw very little of their king. They saw him at staged events, riding a magnificent white stallion during a parade, or waving from a balcony. He looked the part. He was handsome, well-fed, and serene, just as Seraphina intended. The narrative she carefully crafted was that of a wise duchess guiding a young but promising monarch. She was the steady hand on the tiller, the selfless servant of the crown. The propaganda was subtle but effective. Poems were commissioned celebrating her wisdom. Official portraits always showed her standing just behind the king, a look of humble devotion on her face, a look that took her hours to practice in front of a mirror. Behind this carefully constructed facade, Seraphina's ambition was growing. It was no longer just about wealth or influence. It was about control, absolute control. She had come to see the kingdom as a grand chessboard, and she was the only player. Everyone else, the ministers, the generals, the king himself, they were just pieces to be moved at her will. There was a cold, satisfying pleasure in it, a sense of order, of mastery. She had spent her life as a woman in a world run by men, forced to use subtlety and charm as her only weapons. Now she had the ultimate weapon, a king who would do anything she asked. But even in his gilded cage, Alaric sometimes felt a faint, fleeting sense of wrongness. It was like the memory of a dream he couldn't quite grasp. He would be in the middle of a feast, surrounded by laughter and music, and a sudden, inexplicable melancholy would wash over him. He would look at the fawning faces of the new courtiers, and for a moment he would see them not as friends, but as strangers. He would feel a pang of longing for his old simple life, for the days when his biggest worry was a history lesson. But then Seraphina would touch his hand or whisper something amusing in his ear, and the feeling would vanish, dismissed as a passing mood. One afternoon, he wandered into the royal kennels, a place he hadn't visited since his father was alive. He'd had a dog as a boy, a scruffy, loyal mutt named Pip. He found an old kennel master there, a man whose face was a roadmap of wrinkles. The old man's eyes lit up with genuine warmth when he saw Alaric. He said, "Your Majesty," with a bow that was respectful but not fawning. "It is good to see you." For a few minutes they talked about dogs, about the new litter of wolfhounds, about the funny way Pip used to chase his own tail. It was the first real conversation Alaric had had with someone other than Seraphina in months. He felt a strange sense of relief, of lightness. On his way back to his chambers, he felt different, more like himself. He decided, on a whim, that he would invite the kennel master to dine with him that evening. It was a small, silly thing, but it felt important. It felt like his decision. When he told Seraphina, her smile didn't falter, but her eyes went cold for just a fraction of a second. She said, "A lovely idea, my love, but I'm afraid he wouldn't be comfortable. The formalities, you know. He would be so out of place. It would be a kindness not to put him through it." And Alaric, his brief flicker of independence already fading, agreed. Of course, she was right. It would be awkward for the old man. It was a foolish idea. He dismissed it from his mind and thought no more about it. The next day, he was told the old kennel master had retired, effective immediately, due to a sudden and severe allergy to dog hair. A replacement had already been found, a distant relative of Seraphina's, as it happened. Alaric felt a brief, sharp pang of something he couldn't name. But then a servant arrived with a new chess set, carved from ivory and obsidian, a gift from the Duchess, and it was so beautiful, so perfect, that he soon forgot all about the old man and his dogs. The door to his cage, which had been opened just a crack, was now firmly shut again. He didn't even hear the lock click into place. The silence of his gilded world was, after all, very peaceful, and peace was all he had ever really wanted.
You can control a court, you can control a king, but you cannot control the weather. And in the 7th year of Alaric's reign, or more accurately, Seraphina's, the weather decided to stop cooperating. The spring rains never came. The summer that followed was a long, brutal season of baked earth and cloudless skies. The rivers shrank, the fields turned to dust, and the crops withered on the stalk. Veridia, a kingdom whose wealth was built on its bountiful harvests, was facing a famine. This was a problem that could not be solved with a masked ball or a new flock of exotic birds. This was a messy, complicated, and deeply unglamorous crisis. Seraphina, for the first time, felt a flicker of something she wasn't used to: annoyance. Famine was so tedious. The reports from the countryside were filled with dreary statistics about grain yields and starving peasants. It was all very upsetting to the serene atmosphere she had so carefully cultivated at the palace. Her first instinct was to ignore it. She issued a royal decree in Alaric's name, of course, banning the spread of alarmist rumors and assuring the people that the situation was under control. To prove it, she threw one of the most lavish feasts the capital had ever seen. The tables groaned with roasted meats, mountains of pastries,
and wine flowing from silver fountains. The message was clear. There is no crisis here. Look how much food we have. It was, politically speaking, a staggering miscalculation. It's hard to appreciate the finer points of propaganda when your children are hungry. The resentment that had been simmering in the countryside began to boil over. Food riots broke out in the provincial towns. Grain merchants were attacked, their storehouses looted. The local lords sent urgent messages to the capital, begging for aid, for leadership. The messages were received by Seraphina's hand-picked ministers, who, being experts in flattery rather than governance, assured her that it was merely minor unrest, nothing to trouble the king with. But the trouble was spreading. The nobility, who had been content to enjoy Seraphina's parties while she ran the country, were now getting nervous. Starving peasants had a nasty habit of not caring about titles and land deeds. Several prominent barons, whose own lands were suffering, decided to travel to the capital to petition the king directly. This was a breach of the new protocol. One did not simply petition the king. They were made to wait for days. They were told the king was unwell, that he was in seclusion, that he was composing a sonnet. Finally, they were granted a brief audience. Alaric, looking pale and slightly confused, was seated on the throne, with Seraphina standing just behind him. Before the barons could even state their case, Seraphina spoke. Her voice was calm and reassuring. She explained that the crown was aware of the difficulties and that a plan was in place. A new tax, she announced, would be levied on the nobility to fund grain imports. The barons were stunned into silence. A new tax on them to solve a problem the crown had ignored for months? It was outrageous. One of them, a blunt, hot-tempered man named Lord Marius, found his voice. "Your Grace," he said, addressing Seraphina directly, "this is a matter for the king and his council. We came to speak with His Majesty." He looked pointedly at Alaric. For a moment, there was a tense silence. Alaric looked from the angry face of Lord Marius to the serene, smiling face of Seraphina. He felt a familiar wave of anxiety. He opened his mouth to speak, to say something, to agree with Seraphina, probably. But then he saw the desperation in the eyes of the barons. These were his father's men, men he had known since childhood. They looked defeated, and a strange thing happened. A small, rusty gear in the back of Alaric's mind turned for the first time in years. He said, in a voice that was barely a whisper, "Let them speak." Seraphina did not move, but the temperature in the room dropped by several degrees. The smile on her face became a fixed, brittle thing. "My love, you are tired. We had discussed this. The matter is settled." "No," he said. He was surprised as anyone to hear the word come out of his own mouth. He looked at Lord Marius. "Speak." And Lord Marius spoke. He spoke of the dying fields, of the hungry children, of the despair of the people. He spoke plainly, without flattery or fear. He painted a grim, unvarnished picture of the kingdom, a picture that was utterly at odds with the perfumed, peaceful world Alaric inhabited. And as he listened, the fog in his mind began to thin. He saw for the first time a glimpse of the truth, a horrifying glimpse. The audience was cut short. Seraphina, with a look of icy fury, declared the king was fatigued and needed to rest. The barons were dismissed, but the crack had appeared. A small, almost invisible fracture in the perfect polished surface of Seraphina's control. Alaric had contradicted her in public. It was a tiny act of rebellion, but it was a rebellion nonetheless. That night, Seraphina was not her usual warm, seductive self. She was cold, distant. She told her Alaric had embarrassed her, that he had shown weakness, that he had undermined their partnership. She made him feel like a foolish, disobedient child. And Alaric, his brief courage evaporating under her disapproval, felt a crushing wave of guilt and shame. He apologized. He begged for her forgiveness. He promised never to question her again. By morning, he had convinced himself that she was right. He had been foolish. The barons were just being dramatic. Seraphina knew best. She always knew best. He retreated back into the comfort of his gilded cage, pulling the door shut behind him. But he couldn't quite forget the look in Lord Marius's eyes. He couldn't quite unhear the stories of the starving children. The crack had been papered over, but the structure was no longer sound. And somewhere in the city, old Lord Valerius, having heard a detailed account of the audience from a very well-paid guard, allowed himself a small, grim smile. The king, it seemed, was not entirely asleep after all.
The incident with the barons had sent a tremor through the court. On the surface, everything returned to normal. The parties resumed, the wine flowed, and the Duchess Seraphina was as serene and powerful as ever. But underneath, things had changed. The opposition, once scattered and silent, now had a focal point. They had seen the king hesitate. They had seen a flicker of the boy he once was, or the man he could be. It was a small hope, but it was hope nonetheless. Lord Valerius, the old spymaster, knew this was his moment. He began to move, not with speed, but with the deliberate, patient cunning of a spider weaving its web. He reached out through trusted intermediaries to the disgruntled nobles, including the fiery Lord Marius. He didn't propose treason. He didn't speak of rebellion. He spoke of concern. Concern for the king's well-being. Concern for the stability of the realm. He framed it as a rescue mission, not a coup. They were not overthrowing the king. They were saving him from a malignant influence. It was a much more palatable idea. The conspiracy, if you could call it that, was a quiet, cautious affair. It consisted of hushed conversations in dark corners of taverns, of unsigned notes passed by servants, of meetings in the guise of hunting parties. They were a small, unlikely group of allies, old traditionalist lords who resented Seraphina's modern extravagance, and pragmatic merchants who were tired of their businesses being ruined by her whimsical economic policies. They were united by a single common goal: to break the Duchess's hold on the throne. Their biggest challenge was Alaric himself. He was the key, but he was also the lock. He was so thoroughly under Seraphina's spell that simply presenting him with evidence would be useless. She would twist it, deny it, and convince him it was all a plot by her jealous enemies. They needed something undeniable, something that would shatter his illusions so completely that even she could not piece them back together. Valerius's plan was audacious. He had, after many weeks and a small fortune in bribes, finally gotten his hands on what he needed. The valet, with the sister in need of a dowry, had delivered. Not the royal seal itself, but something far better: a collection of documents from the king's private study. Documents Alaric had signed, but clearly never read. And, most damningly, a series of letters. Letters written in Seraphina's elegant hand to her various cousins and allies who now held high office. Letters that detailed with chilling clarity her plans, her manipulations, and her utter contempt for the king she so tenderly called my love. She referred to him as the puppet, my beautiful simpleton, and in one particularly cruel passage,
the crown I wear to bed. Now they had the weapon. The problem was how to deliver it. Alaric was a prisoner in his own palace, surrounded by Seraphina's loyalists. Every servant, every guard was one of her eyes and ears. To approach him directly was impossible. They needed a way in, a crack in the fortress of his daily routine. And Valerius, ever the student of human nature, found one in the most unlikely of places, the royal confectioner. Alaric had a weakness for marzipan, specifically for small, intricately shaped marzipan animals. It was a childish habit he had never outgrown, one of the few pieces of his old self that remained. Every night, a small plate of them was delivered to his chambers. The confectioner was a grumpy old man who despised the new court, but who took immense pride in his work. He was also, Valerius discovered, deeply in debt. A quiet conversation, a clear debt, and a promise of a royal pension was all it took. The plan was set. The incriminating letters were carefully copied onto thin, translucent paper in a script that mimicked the confectioner's own hand, as if they were notes on a new recipe. They were then sealed within a hollow marzipan swan, a masterpiece of sugary engineering. It was a ridiculous, almost comical plan, a conspiracy that hinged on a candy bird. But in the court of Veridia, the absurd was often the most effective path. That night, Alaric sat alone in his chambers, the silence broken only by the crackling of the fire. Seraphina was hosting a poetry reading, an event Alaric had been allowed to skip as his delicate constitution was apparently not up to the strain of extended rhyming. He felt that familiar, nameless melancholy again. He felt empty. The plate of marzipan was delivered. He picked up the swan, admiring its delicate craftsmanship. It felt slightly heavier than usual. His finger found a seam. Curious, he broke it open. Inside, nestled in the sugary fragments, was the roll of thin paper. He unrolled it. He saw the familiar, elegant handwriting. He began to read. At first, he was just confused. These were Seraphina's words, but they made no sense. They were cold, calculating, and then he saw it. The phrase, "my beautiful simpleton." His world, which had been a soft, comfortable dream, suddenly became a nightmare of stark, brutal clarity. Every memory of the past 7 years replayed in his mind, but now tainted, twisted. Every tender word, every loving glance, every shared secret. It was all a lie, a performance, a script written by the woman he loved, in which he was the starring fool. The gilded cage had vanished, and he saw for the first time the cold, hard bars of his prison. He was not a king. He was not even a man. He was a toy, a plaything for a woman who despised him. He didn't rage. He didn't weep. He just sat there in the silent, fire-lit room. The pieces of the broken swan and the broken fragments of his life
scattered on the table before him. The fog had finally lifted, and the reality it revealed was unbearable. He looked at his own hands, the hands that had signed away his kingdom for a series of empty caresses. He felt a slow, cold anger begin to burn where his heart used to be. The quiet unraveling was complete. What came next would be the reckoning. A very sleepy, very quiet reckoning, but a reckoning all the same. The next morning, King Alaric woke up a different person. The boy was gone, and in his place was a man made of ice and quiet fury. He moved through his morning routine with a calm, deliberate precision that unnerved his servants. He dressed himself, waving away their assistance. He chose a simple, dark tunic, the kind his father used to wear. When Seraphina came to his chambers, smiling, ready to begin another day of managing his life, she found him standing by the window, looking out over the city. "Good morning, my love," she said, her voice a warm caress. She moved to embrace him, but he stepped aside. "I will be attending the council meeting this morning," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. Seraphina's smile wavered. "Of course, but we had planned to go riding. Don't you remember?" "The ride is cancelled," he said, without turning to look at her. "Send a message to the council. Tell them to expect me." The council chamber was abuzz with confusion when the king entered. He had not attended a full, unscheduled meeting in years. He walked to his chair at the head of the table and sat. Seraphina's allies, the ministers and officials she had installed, exchanged nervous glances. Seraphina herself swept in a moment later, her face a perfect mask of serene concern for her king's sudden whim. She took her customary place, standing just behind his chair. "Your Majesty," one of the ministers began, "we were about to discuss the new tariffs on wool." "We will not be discussing tariffs," Alaric said, his voice cutting through the room. He placed a small rolled-up piece of paper on the table, the confession from the marzipan swan. No, that was a step too far. He placed the letters, the actual damning letters, on the table. "We will be discussing treason." He looked directly at Seraphina. For the first time, she saw something in his eyes she had never seen before. Resolve. The game was up, but she was not one to fold easily. "My love, you are unwell," she said, her voice full of theatrical pity. "You have been under such strain. Let me escort you back to your chambers." She placed a hand on his shoulder. He shrugged it off as if it were a snake. "Do not touch me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. He looked around the table at the pale, frightened faces of her puppets. "And do not call me that again." He then proceeded, in a calm, methodical voice, to read from her letters. He read her words of contempt, her boasts of manipulation, her detailed instructions on how to bleed the kingdom for her own gain. With every sentence, the color drained from the faces of her allies. The mask of loyalty melted away, revealing the raw panic beneath. When she was finished, there was a dead silence in the room. Seraphina stood, frozen, her perfect composure finally cracking. She looked for the first time like a woman who had lost. "These are forgeries, lies spun by my enemies." "Are they?" He gestured to the captain of the guard, a man who had been quietly replaced just a week earlier by one of Lord Valerius's men. "Arrest the Duchess and these ministers. Confine them to their quarters until a full inquiry can be made." There was no struggle, no dramatic showdown. Seraphina's power had been built on an illusion, the illusion of her control over the king. The moment that was shattered, her power ceased
to exist. The courtiers who had followed her out of ambition and fear abandoned her in an instant. They were survivors, and the tide had just turned. As the guards led her away, she gave Alaric one last look. It was a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He met her gaze without flinching, then turned his attention back to the council table. The aftermath was quiet. There were no executions. Alaric had seen enough deception. He had no stomach for blood. Seraphina was exiled. She was sent to a remote, wind-swept castle on the northern coast, one of her own family's properties. She was allowed to take her gowns, her jewels, her books of poetry. She was given a gilded cage of her own to live out the rest of her days in luxurious, powerless isolation, a fittingly ironic and sleepy end. Her allies were dismissed, stripped of their titles and lands, and sent away in disgrace. Lord Valerius was recalled from his retirement and quietly reinstated as the king's most trusted advisor. Alaric's reign truly began that day. He was a changed man. The naivete was gone, replaced by a deep, weary cynicism. He was quiet, thoughtful, and slow to trust. He listened to his advisors. He read the documents before signing them, and he never, ever allowed anyone to stand behind his throne. He never married. The court became much more boring and much better run place. Sometimes late at night, when the palace was silent, he would walk the halls of the sunstone citadel. He would look at the polished surfaces, the mirrors that once shown him a false reflection of himself. He was no longer the boy king, the beautiful simpleton. He was Alaric the sad, Alaric the wary, Alaric the king. He had learned the hardest lesson a ruler can learn, that the most dangerous chains are not made of iron, but of whispered words and gentle touches, and that true power is not the ability to command others, but the quiet, lonely strength to command oneself. And so our story ends. The court of mirrors stands as beautiful as ever, but its reflections are a little clearer now, a little more honest. A kingdom was lost, and a kingdom was saved. A boy was broken, and a king was made, all because of a few whispers and a hollow marzipan swan. A strange and sleepy little tale. Now, just let your thoughts drift. There are no more plots to uncover, no more decrees to sign. Just the quiet, gentle darkness. Just sleep.